Hey, what's up, everybody? This is Hamp, or Game Logic, as some of you might know me from the Rounding Off Infinity Gaming channel on YouTube. Back with another episode of Talking About Games, or TAG, my solo cast series of discussions about the gaming news, technology, finance, regulatory issues, legal issues, etc. So, for those of you who happened to see my Twitter post last night saying that I was going live and then proceeded to not see me actually go live, that is because I am in the process of trying to move all of my podcasting to a Mac. And so um, because I'm not as familiar with the series, I got the Mac at the beginning of October, but I haven't been on a Mac in, I don't know, almost maybe 10 years. Although that's where I started podcasting from, on an old MacBook Pro. So I convinced myself that I had a network problem that didn't actually exist. Got myself tied in knots. Didn't get it sorted out for about an hour. But then it was midnight, so it was a little too late to go live. So I figured I would just start this morning. Another transition that's going on in the show since the last time I recorded an episode, and I haven't recorded an episode in a very long time. I'm planning on trying to get back to it. But I've also since transitioned to not gaming on console. So I'm PC only now. What that does is that kind of shifts the focus and what I pay attention to, and thereby results in, the things that I'm going to talk about on Talking About Games. So still pay attention to a lot of stuff that goes on in the industry, but I tend to be less concerned or focused on what some people who make maybe disingenuous arguments about the gaming space are saying, as their comments are driven by, the need to console war and brand represent. And I'm just kind of backing away from the table of being kind of associated and around all that. So without much further ado, let's get to it. I will also mention I'm probably a little less polished this morning. The script is a little less scripted. I was on business travel Monday through Wednesday this week. I got back very, very, very late Wednesday, and then had a full day yesterday trying to catch up on all the meetings and stuff that I'd missed. So not all of these stories have been prepared with as much painstaking detail as I normally try and go about it, but we will get through it as best that we can. If you're not familiar with the show, I do often have to take breaks to drink coffee and get something to drink because it's just me. So let's start with the first news story, and we'll struggle through the first thing that I always mess up, which is trying to remember how to share my screen on on StreamYard. So this first news story over on Ars Technica. Will the new Nintendo Music app lead to more DMCA takedowns from Nintendo? The story, like I said, over on Ars Technica by Kyle Orland. Last night, Nintendo pulled off a surprise launch of a new Nintendo Music smartphone app offering many of the company's staple soundtrack songs as a perk to Nintendo Switch Online subscribers. But the new subscription freebie could give Nintendo additional motivation to once again crack down on internet users who have been collecting and posting Nintendo music online for years now. So, oh boy. Sorry, the MacBook security settings that got implemented in Sonoma, I think, just giving me a bunch of hassles about recording my screen. So sorry about that. So if you're not familiar with it, like I said, as the article indicates, Nintendo started an online music subscription, which I haven't really had the opportunity to dig very deep into, but as far as I understand, in a kind of a weird, Nintendo's always kind of weird about how it approaches its online services, but actually allows you to stream the music, I guess, on your phone, which again was kind of like the whole way they went about comms on their online service, having that happen on your phone rather than on the console itself. But at any rate, I still think it's a pretty attractive service. It's actually an add-on to Nintendo Switch Online, which I don't think incurs any additional cost. And so there are probably obviously a lot of people who are nostalgic about Nintendo music and like having that stuff available. I know that since I went to streaming music and went to Amazon Music and Spotify, I have also become enamored with some game soundtracks. I often play. Sorry, I got a little bit of a frog in my throat this morning. I often play things like the Call of Duty soundtrack. I often also tell people that a really banging soundtrack that kind of sneaks up on you, and I don't think about often is the Miles Morales soundtrack for Marvel's Spider-Man. So, and I know that there are people out there who are really big into the Final Fantasy soundtracks and the Skyrim soundtrack and things like that. So, I think this will be a good deal. But the side note that goes along with this is a lot of the extremely litigious action that we've seen Nintendo partake in very recently, and there are theories that this has something to do with what some of the plans are for the Nintendo Switch 2. So. Along with this article, I agree that having established a more tangible, evident, firm foothold in the music space and putting its IP on offer via legitimate digital channel, Nintendo is absolutely armed to now go after anyone who's out there distributing chiptunes or whatever of Nintendo's musical IP. And we know that happens. People go out and they make recreations of Nintendo tracks, specifically to appeal to that nostalgia. I don't know that anybody is out there monetizing it. I'm sure, I reckon that somebody somewhere is, because people on YouTube are trying to monetize everything these days. But the key thing is that because trademark defense in particular, and in some ways the knock-on effect to just generic IP defense has a lot to do with you being actively engaged in defending that IP, and that may have been more difficult from a legal perspective for Nintendo to assert if a lot of that music is from old titles that are no longer on sale, and are no longer available via any channel or network. As we know, there are lots of things that Nintendo puts in a vault or just doesn't put on offer on its online services. So how vigorously they're going to go about doing this defense, I'm not sure. I'm just saying that I think that they're pretty well set up to do so by having that active streaming service and an active catalog that they are directly selling to the public. I also don't think it was the sole purpose of setting up that music service, that it was singularly equipped for the express purpose of weaponizing it. But I do think, as a lot of other people do, that it's part of a larger IP defense effort that Nintendo is putting in place as a precursor to the capabilities of the Nintendo Switch 2. And so one might imagine that when the Nintendo Switch 2 comes along, that the music service is going to be available there. But maybe to a larger, in terms of a larger impact. Some of the media speculated that a lot of what's going on is that the reasoning behind the aggressive defense of Nintendo's IP and its use for emulation is that the Switch 2 will handle multiple generations of backwards compatibility, but also that there may be a burgeoning PC-based service being worked on as well. If you go back to the Microsoft emails that got surfaced out of the hearing, we saw that there were notes in there that Nintendo was becoming interested in the PC space, and so it might stand to reason that means the launch potentially of a service available on that platform. And in that case, Nintendo would only want its own proprietary service as the one way to play its back catalog of games on PC. It may be also the only way that they want their music to be able to be played on PC. Now, what I haven't pulled the thread on is I don't know if any part of the Nintendo music catalog is available on Spotify or Amazon. It would seem that would have been an easier way to come about distributing their music, making it available, and by the same token, being able to mount that legal defense if they were going to go after somebody. So, maybe that's where that theory is a little slippery, but I'll try and check on that over the weekend. But like I said, maybe the Switch 2 will also be able to play music, and maybe this rumored service will also support music streaming directly on the new console. But I wouldn't put it at all past Nintendo that this IP defense is not organically woven into a larger strategy behind putting this out on a service. Nintendo going to do what Nintendo going to do, and if you're out there distributing their IP in any format, they're very likely to come after you. Let's go on to story number 2. I'll bring that up on the screen. I'm also going to take a break for a couple seconds to get something to drink. Great. Yeah, this is what I trying to drive StreamYard. I wound up sharing oh my gosh. So now it's popping this Chrome security thing because of, like I said, the back end of the security settings on Mac OS. Every time I open up a document and share the screen. Okay. Jeez. This is way more complicated than it needs to be. So the next story is going to be about how Nintendo doesn't credit composers on its new Nintendo Music app. And like I said, give me just 1 second. So this news story over on Game Developer, which for people who are unfamiliar is the site that used to be known as Game Sutra. I mentioned this on I think Enough to Keep Going a couple weeks ago, or maybe on the last Brap rant that I was on. Game Sutra, or what is now changed its name to Game Developer, is actually the media organization behind GDC. So they just made their website name synonymous with the conference. So maybe that's a little easier to associate their brand as the people who directly support that conference. But this new story over on Game Developer by Bryant Francis. Yesterday, Nintendo dropped a fun new way to celebrate the many wonderful soundtracks that have accompanied its games for years. It debuted Nintendo Music, an app dedicated to soundtracks from its storied history. It's available only to Nintendo Switch Online members, making it another unique driver of Nintendo's entry into subscription services. There's just one catch. The app doesn't credit any composers. If you log into the app and pick a song, the track information button just says the name, the game it appears in, and a Nintendo copyright notice. So this is interesting. I think one of the things this may bump into, and therefore why it might be a mistake, is the industry rules are incredibly stringent, despite the SAG-AFTRA strike that's going on now, and the fight over AI that the union is having. It's interesting. We're going to talk about another union issue here this morning. Is having with representatives of the industry that are being represented by like Activision, EA, 2K, and some other of their organizations. The industry is actually really stringent about the rules around crediting artists and people who participate in the production of a video game. Now, that being said, it gets skipped by numerous times. There's often companies who orient around, and I don't know that it's necessarily. I don't know that whether I land on whether which part is fair or not. I think a lot of companies will go in this direction of not crediting people who are contractors and didn't spend that long on the production, and I kind of understand that. I think that the rules from the union perspective, and maybe what was agreed to in past union negotiations, is that if anybody spends any time working on a game, that they're to be credited. I'm not sure which end of that spectrum is true. They both are representative of extreme ends, left and right of the spectrum. I think the people that I definitely empathize with are the creators and the developers who will say, hey, I spent, a not insignificant amount of time working on this production, and I didn't get credited. Sometimes that's because they were part of they were an employee of a subcontractor who worked on the game, and some members of that crew weren't credited or were only credited by the company name. I'm not sure. There's lots of different scenarios that I've seen. So, but this may run them afoul of those union rules. I'm not exactly sure if the various unions will go after this simply on principle, regardless of whether or not those composers are actually part of the union in some manner. But it's a little weird, and like I said, I'm more believing that it was a mistake rather than something intentional. The quote here is, once again, Nintendo is trying to maintain the illusion that everything they release is created by a monolith, and it's disappointing. Part of the thing that this comment is around is, and again, maybe it's on us who report on the news or talk on the news. I know I have a problem. Part of the problem is I'm just not a super huge Nintendo fan. I own the Nintendo Wii and the Switch. Those were actually the only two Nintendo consoles I've ever owned. I know that there are other big fans, but quite honestly, like, it is not readily apparent on the surface often when, what studio in Nintendo. Like, I couldn't rattle off a list of Nintendo studios even, and I feel like the only people who are really cognizant of that in the gaming community and who make content are people who are like super deep into Nintendo. I mean, to the extent that sometimes it's even people who read Japanese, and are really deep into that culture and understand the whole Japanese industrial backdrop to the video game industry, which I just don't understand thoroughly from a regional perspective. But that, right, is that veil that is kind of surrounds Nintendo and news reporting. And I agree with it, right, that this is, not necessarily that this is an effort to present that monolith, but that it's just an endemic generic problem from trying to gain insight into Nintendo. The comment here is the list of unnamed composers included runs pretty long. I'm not going to try and pronounce these names. Yuka isn't credited for her work on the Fire Emblem series. Yamamoto is not listed as the music meister behind Metroid Prime. I want to know who composed KK Slider Slick Tunes. Tataka and his collaborators are unfortunately absent. Yeah, so I'm not sure exactly, what cultural knit is going on in the background of Nintendo. I don't know that I don't think, as far as I remember, that they've had like a changeover of leadership or anything that would have driven like a change in their culture and kind of how they're handling things. Like I said, the extreme litigiousness about going after people for emulators and other things. YouTubers for posting Nintendo content has been pretty extreme over the last few months. Them going after Pal World, and like I said, I think that has a lot to do with whatever they're planning for the Switch 2, which I do think that there is. Because the first thing that we heard about backwards compatibility for the Switch 2 was kind of via inferences to what they were going to do with their online service. If you remember, over the last several generations, going all the way back to the Wii, and inclusive of some of their handhelds, when a lot of those services came online and their virtual stores came online, the big problem with Nintendo that I saw as a consumer is that every time they switch platforms, you wouldn't have access to the content you had bought through whatever virtual store on the previous device. And so the only way to get access, right, to a Mario title or whatever legacy title you had previously purchased was to purchase it again in their new store. And so it's a pretty revolutionary concept, in my opinion, that the next time around, we're actually going to get, well, I mean, I'm not on the Nintendo Switch anymore, but you guys are actually going to get access to the same content that you bought on the Switch, which has had one of the longest, maybe the longest service life of any Nintendo platform, at running in excess of 7 years, probably 8 by the time it's all over. So to me, they're clearly spending much more focus this time on their online services. Their online services have always been a kludge. The notion that actually one of the first tangible things we've heard of what's going on with this generation is what's going on with the service, I think is pretty significant, and to me would seem to represent that they were putting a lot more effort and people and bodies on that effort in their intention to make it compatible and accessible with the Nintendo Switch 2. So it'll be interesting to see how that unfolds. Hopefully this knit will get worked out. Nintendo has an incredibly long legacy of persistent composers. I think maybe in contrast to the way a lot of the rest of the industry and a lot of the rest of industry IP and franchises tend to come out. They have several composers who have done all of the music or the bulk of the music for a long running franchise that has run for decades, and so it's both weird and unfortunate, particularly in this era where such a large part of our dialogue is around game preservation. Um, and as we've also seen, a lot of these creators, unfortunately, who are getting aged, pass away, and so it now becomes a matter of not just industry credit and union collective bargaining of how these things are supposed to be handled, but also just honoring the legacy of creatives that have come before and that have become so synonymous and woven into gamers' memories and nostalgia for given titles. All right, so I'm going to take another quick break, and we're going to move on to our next story. I think I stopped sharing that out. And this brings us to the other union topic that I said that we were going to go over. And this one is going to get fairly interesting, because I guess I could probably be accused of being quite opinionated on this particular topic. So be 1 second, take a drink break. We'll keep going. Okay, news story number 3. CWA claims Sony looking to further monopoly position with latest studio closures. This story also over on Game Developer by Chris Kerr. The Communication Workers of America has lambasted Sony over its decision to shutter Firewalk Studios in Neon Koi. So if you're unfamiliar with that story, the studio behind Concord, which in a fairly unprecedented manner was shut down, I think the game was shuttered within, I think, 2 weeks of launch. Which actually at the time, I had done an analysis before that happened that said that was exactly the right move by PlayStation. In my opinion, I had recommended that they do that. That would lead them to being able to affect savings by writing down those costs on the yearly on their SEC filings. I'm sorry, on their I can't remember what the European name is or the international name is for the standards that they conform to for their accounting reporting. But that would actually lead to a less impactful financial hit from Concord, rather than letting it be this kind of wilting vine that they kept pumping money into over time. And at the time that I said that would be the more prudent thing for PlayStation to do, I also mentioned that, look, I certainly don't wish for layoffs or a studio closure, but we should also recognize just the historical truth of how these things have typically gone down at PlayStation Studios. Is that if you drop a game that doesn't hit, in fact, quite honestly, the only studio that sticks out in my mind is Bend with Days Gone, and I think the retrospective is, as far as we know, that game actually did okay on sales numbers. It definitely did fine on sales numbers after it launched on PC, and so in aggregate, those sales numbers were fine. But Nintendo, but PlayStation was still not happy with the overall review scores and the critical uptake of that game. And despite that, Bend Studios was one of the few studios that, in my mind and in my memory, survived that. But quite typically, quite often, the case is that when these things go down at PlayStation, it is not unusual for your studio to be closed, particularly if you are working on a game in this day and age, in the more recent kind of Jim Ryan, Herman Hulst era, where if there is a concern that your IP kind of isn't kind of aligning and conforming to what I don't want to call it the PlayStation template, but like the core PlayStation creative thrust is. And so if you talk about those big tentpole franchises like Uncharted, The Last of Us, maybe to a lesser extent Ratchet and Clank, your studio is definitely in danger. Now, Concord seemed like it was kind of aligned with that big AAA type of content that PlayStation likes to have kind of synonymous with their brand name. But regardless, like I said, they were in significant danger of closure, and now here we are. Continuing on with the article, the labor union said the latest round of layoffs at Sony makes it clear that video game workers must pursue the security of collective bargaining. And I'm going to keep reading until until I get to a quote that I want to particularly pick at. The CWA, collective bargaining not only allows workers a seat at the table to bargain for fair compensation, but also a voice on the job to have a say over how workers will be impacted by job cuts. Now, I want to stop there and harp on that. That's actually not the quote that I want to pick at a lot this morning. But this goes along, it harmonizes with a warning that I often talked about during the ongoing hearings, and actually really the 2 years, I guess, plus whatever that went on with the Microsoft Xbox acquisition. There were a lot of pundits and influencers that seemed to make an effort to convince people that a great thing coming out of the Xbox acquisition, the Xbox merger with Activision, was going to be improvement of working conditions. And one of the things that a lot of people alluded to was that that unions were going to somehow, hold back the notion of layoffs. And as I've continually tried to tell people and continue to try to educate, like, unions do nothing directly to prevent layoffs. Maybe only slightly, in that they cause companies to kind of think twice about the impact and cause them to do a little more analysis. But they don't prevent layoffs from happening. The company is going to do layoffs if that's what's needed to trim operating costs in order to improve their bottom line and the financial health of the company. What unions wind up doing in the collective bargaining aspect of protecting workers is they will typically come to agreements in how employee layoffs are handled. And unfortunately, what often comes out of that is a bias towards the protection of senior workers. What does that do in a technical workforce? Quite often, the dynamic in a technical workforce is that people who are less senior have the ability to be competitive based on talent and a meritocratic approach in the technical ranks. I'm not necessarily saying more so than in other trades, but I will say, in particular, in the technical ranks. My own personal mantra with my bosses in the past at large companies that I worked at was just being very open and transparent with them and telling them, I'm not going to wait in line. Like, if I have a boss who I'm more competent than, or a peer who I'm more competent than, I'm not going to wait in line because that person has been around for a long time, either for pay or for promotion. And when I have been at organizations where I have noticed or seen or felt that was the trend or that was the case, then that was a company that I chose not to work for anymore. That is, I would say, equally and maybe even vastly more prevalent in like millennials and alphas, to a point where it even like aggravates me, just in terms of some of the expectations around that, and some of the, quite honestly, like in the software development ranks, some of the kind of lofty opinions that have come out of like the pandemic and post-pandemic time, and the salaries that people expect and things of that nature. But in your technical ranks, like a way to disincentivize your highly talented knowledge workers is to lay off people who are super highly talented because they're not the most senior. Not only does that have a negative impact on the people who are walking away, and they're going to carry negative opinions with them and talk to their friends about it, blah, blah, blah. That's okay, right? That's collateral damage, and you kind of expect that. But it's also going to cause a negative impact on morale of the people who get retained, because in particular, your younger workers who see those highly talented people walk away because they're not senior, it means that they're all left and have to continue to do the work with a less talented team potentially that's still on deck. And so this is kind of one of the dynamics that unions can have that might be okay in other trades, but in the knowledge worker ranks can actually be a negative impact, right, in the overall impact on the organization. Doesn't necessarily impact, right, when you talk about the stratification of people's salaries, isn't necessarily going to be as much of an impact to people in the lower ranks. But I would say your younger generation of worker who through talent has become highly paid, that is something that they're not going to be interested in. Your really highly paid talent overall, as I've continued to mention over the last couple of years, isn't interested in unionization in general, overall, because collective bargaining actually could potentially wind up negatively impacting their overall earnings. When you take a highly talented knowledge worker who's highly paid, when I say highly paid, I'm not talking about people who make 100K, right? We're talking about people in the even higher strata than that. What you're telling that person is that regardless of your talents, your salary is going to be bargained for along with everyone else. So if you're a top 10% performer, the dampening effect on your max earning potential actually, cuts against the total vertical direction that your salary might head. So continuing on in the article, the CWA described the 2 PlayStation studio closures as devastating and claimed highly insulated video game CEOs are creating perilous working conditions for video game workers by eliminating their job stability. I don't disagree with that. The organization suggested that Sony's decision to shutter mobile studio Neon Koi shows the PlayStation maker is largely interested in furthering its monopoly. Now we're getting down to the thing that kind of bothers me. Shows the PlayStation maker is largely interested in furthering its monopoly position in the video game industry, and said it would be sharing its concerns with regulators and policymakers. CWA calls Sony's practices anti-competitive. Sony's decision to dissolve studios outside their walled garden of PlayStation exclusive content, rather than making games that have to compete in a highly diverse and competitive mobile game market, should be a cautionary warning sign of Sony's interest in furthering their monopoly position in the video game industry, it continued. So this is the major problem that I have with the CWA, and this will now back on to like a trend of things that I've observed about the CWA over the last few years. This quote, first of all, that quote to me is just a word salad of non sequitur circular logic that makes no sense to me whatsoever. You can't become a monopoly of an industry because they said they were trying to monopolize their position in the video game industry. So they're asserting that Sony is trying to become a monopoly of the video game industry, trying to take over the entire thing and become the singular, or at least the primary and most preferred supplier in the entire video game industry, which by definition includes the subsectors of PC, console, and mobile. You can't become a monopoly of an industry that is a parent of a sub-market or a child of that market by deciding not to participate in the subsector unless the intent is to run the subsector out of business, which would be impossible for PlayStation to do in the mobile gaming market. So what the point of my statement is, you can't become a monopoly of the video game industry, which by definition includes PC, console, and mobile, by choosing not to participate in mobile, which they're accusing Sony of. How would you ever become a monopoly of a subsector of the market that you're not participating in, unless your intention is, like I said, to push mobile out of business? Mobile is the bulk of the gaming industry and the gaming market, and so you're not going to be able to topple over mobile gaming in an effort to become a monopoly. Second of all, when we didn't assert that Microsoft or Xbox was a monopoly of the video game industry, I've never accused Xbox of trying to become a monopoly. Right? Keywords that are in this environment that various people blow past often is that it's not just antitrust, it is also antitrust, anti-competition. And that was a lot of my accusations of the dynamic of what would go on with the Xbox acquisition of Activision. This kind of nonsense, though, is why I routinely point to the CWA as being inconsistent. I have no problem with the notion that their mission statement is to protect the rights of workers, but I do have a problem with that mission being executed on opportunistically based on what they convince themselves is the altruistic or benevolent intention of a corporation, as was the case with the Xbox merger with Activision. We'll go back through that history here in a little bit, thereby misleading its members and onlooking bystanders that the intentions of said corporation are good, or in this case, with PlayStation, the opposite of good, and then exposing those workers to the unfortunate fates the moment the corporation decides to act in its own best interest, which, newsflash, it was doing all along. So my point of that is that the CWA initially was against the acquisition of Activision by Microsoft. Then when they signed a neutrality agreement, a union neutrality agreement, an organized labor neutrality agreement with Microsoft, suddenly it became in support of the acquisition. Now, my problem is that everybody who was an onlooking bystander should have recognized that the only reason Microsoft signed that neutrality agreement was to gain the CWA's support for the merger, which to me seems disingenuous. You weren't interested in doing a thing that one might argue was the right thing to do until it served your own corporate interests. and then has fought vigorously in support of that merger up until the time after the merger that Xbox did, in conjunction with Microsoft, larger, did multiple rounds of layoffs. And then they started, right, screaming, yelling, belly aching, Sturm and Drang angst, right, about the layoffs. And I'm like, you're a labor union. You're supposed to be SMEs about the dynamics of corporations and how they treat workers. The notion that you didn't consider that mass layoffs would occur after this merger shows either just a vast amount of incompetence, or like I said, just kind of lathering yourself up and believing that Xbox's intentions or Microsoft's intentions were altruistic and benevolent. Again, these are terms that are a problem in the gaming community because, in my opinion, we overlay these false ethical frameworks on corporations and attribute to them properties of and characteristics of human beings and human spirit. And we shouldn't, because they're not people. Yes, they're formed by people, but a corporation is not a person. Its behavior is the aggregate of a lot of input and dynamics from its employees, but it's not in and of itself a human being. We shouldn't make it anthropomorphic like we do with animals and fairy tales. A corporation is, at the end of the day, always going to act in its best interest. And over time, no merger, no acquisition is being done because some company has an altruistic, benevolent intention to deliver lower prices to consumers. It is always about gaining market share over your competitor. And the moment that you have gained that market share and you have the ability to project your own power and exert your own will, you raise prices. If you look at the history of acquisitions and mergers, that is always, almost to 100%, the case. In similar vein, every increment of that scenario that would operate in the opposite, i.e., it's attempting to accuse Sony of monopolistic intent using a vector of argument that makes little or to no sense, is equally misleading and disinformation, and lends itself to further reinforcement of the organization's lack of credibility. My problem with kind of the way that the CWA behaves is that, to me, they come off as disingenuous, not credible. They boogeyman, Don Quixote, make up arguments that, as we see in this case, are completely not backed by any factual analysis. And that, to me, if I'm negotiating with somebody on a contractual issue at a bargaining table, makes you incredibly not credible. Incredibly not credible. Okay, so there, I said that. But then I question, well, what then becomes the bargaining strength of that organization, and why would I pay attention to them? You pay attention to them probably just because they have the numbers and they wage the influence. But it's not the Socratic method that comes through in a negotiation and that makes anything that they say provable. The other problem that I have is, like I said, their own workers, their own members, people who observe these things. A lot of the dynamic in the gaming community and the discussion around it winds up becoming very disingenuous because the inherent arguments are disingenuous in the first place. In the Microsoft ATVI merger, the CWA initially opposed the merger, signed a deal with Microsoft to labor formation neutrality, suddenly endorsed the merger, and went to bat for it several times. And then when Microsoft subsequently did multiple rounds of layoffs and a round of studio closures, the CWA decried those actions. Many of us warned that these were the types of anti-worker behaviors that would occur after the merger. Did the leadership of the CWA not know what the rest of us did? The historical proof, yes, I am reiterating some things that I said before, but I want to jump on this square 2-3 times. The historical proof is that mergers and massive industry consolidation are never good for consumers in the long run. No corpo is trying to make an acquisition out of the benevolence of its heart and altruism. It is for market share and for strategic advantage. By the same token, Sony's actions are not representative of good guy behavior either. So I want to make sure that that's clear. But neither are they representative of behavior seeking to, quote, make a monopoly of the gaming industry. That's just kind of just ridiculous hyperbole. The CWA needs to come to the argument with other more credible tactics than either boogeymanning causalities that are not there, as well as championing and pinning the good guy label on corpos that are just out to increase their bottom line. So my large takeaway from this is it doesn't really do anyone, including the CWA, its workers, other people who are onlookers, but also, when you get into, yes, they're a labor union, but I mean, to me, they're a labor union and kind of a lobbyist as well. And it doesn't make their position and their takes credible on the political landscape either. All right, so we're going to go on to the next story after a quick break. Okay, now onto a bit of gaming news and one of the games that I'm tracking and I'm super interested in. New Civilization 7 leader looks set to turn everyone against each other's story over on PC Games N by Alex McHugh. One thing it's always important to remember in any Civilization game is to never trust anyone. You have to keep in mind that everyone you meet, from peace-loving pals to warmongers, is only ever truly out for themselves. Sounds very similar to the Union story that we just went over. In Civilization 7, one new leader looks like that'll be made much more obvious as Niccolo Machiavelli is joining the fray, and he looks set to do whatever it takes to come out on top. So not a ton of meat to the story, just a little more drib-drab of the marketing campaign of Civilization 7. Civilization 7 will launch on Tuesday, February 11th, 2025. You can go over to Steam, you can wishlist it. And information continues to roll out. It's kind of interesting. I love Civilization. Actually, I'm going to play a little bit tonight of Civ 6. But sorry, I'm distracted by this ad for the containing characters from The Office. But one aspect that I think is good about this being included in Civ 7, Civilization has one of the like greatest knock-on effects that I personally love, and it was one of the reasons why I got involved in the series, or have stuck with the series. So I was a history major in undergrad, and one of the things I love about Civ is it causes you to, you see these historical characters and things, and I'm very bad about keeping my banners up with the news stories. One of the things that I have always loved is how I see something and I'm like, oh, like I remember that from a history class, or I quite frankly don't remember that from a history class. Let me go read and look that up. And so I do tons of, dumpster diving into historical texts and posts and articles about particular elements of history. So what I don't remember, and why I why I was interested in this article and why I pulled it was I don't remember how much, I guess in Civ 6, I feel like it must have started on some version of Civ that leaders started being incorporated who were not actually political leaders in a historical context. Maybe that's not the case, but I feel like for the vast majority of the series that like leaders were actually rulers of nations or elected officials of nations. Machiavelli was obviously never actually like politically in charge of Italy. He just wrote political philosophy books and texts on the topic. So I do want to go back and see, like, has that been going on the whole time, or is that something that recently got incorporated with some pivot in the series? So I'd be super interested to kind of look at that from the historical aspect of the franchise, and I will take some time to get around to that maybe later this weekend. We'll go on to the next news story. So we're going to keep it rolling here. This is one I was particularly interested in. Dragon Age: The Veilguard beats Inquisition Steam record by 500% in 1 hour. This story also over on PC Games N, again by Mr. Alex McHugh. The day many fans have been waiting for has finally arrived. Dragon Age: The Veilguard has launched after nearly 10 years without a new entry in the Dragon Age series. Though a name like this should draw some huge attention, there have been worries that it may end up underperforming. While it's too early to say for sure just how much of an impact it'll have, initial Steam player figures indicate that it's heading in the right direction. And so this is a comparison to, the past sales of Dragon Age. I sometimes don't know that these comparisons hold a ton of weight. Obviously, as time goes on, we get more gamers into the market. And so despite all the Sturm and Drang about like the market isn't growing, I would still contend that there's a larger addressable market of players who might be interested in Dragon Age the Veilguard now, than there were at the time of Dragon Age Inquisition. And so I kind of naturally expect that there should be larger sales of like the later title. You would hope. So I don't know that these things hold a lot of weight, but what I do think it holds some weight about is a lot of the narrative that's been going on around the effort to, I want to say, dampen the potential market impact of Dragon Age the Veilguard, largely issued, as far as I can tell, by this radicalized group of so-called gamers, many of whom I seriously doubt are actually gamers, around DEI. And so most of this is so incredibly like ridiculous to me that most of this issue is around the character generator and some of the options that are available in the character creator, which I personally think the character creator has actually done pretty good. Mutual of mine, Innate, mentioned that he felt that I haven't had a chance to talk to Innate about this, but mentioned that he felt the character generator had some shortfalls, but there were aspects of it that were good. My personal take on it is that I personally need in a character creator in an RPG this design that cuts a very fine line, and it's actually a difficult like rubric to do well in. I don't I don't envy the designers who have to craft this thing in a way that sticks the landing for me personally. But what I want is a character creator that has a lot of bells, whistles, handles, levers, dials, switches you can flip right to manipulate your character's appearance. But I don't like being forced through them. And what I mean by that is often there are character creators that will force you to make choices about elements of physical appearance that I just don't care about. Like I don't care about often like my character's eyes and their eyebrow. Like there's just some things that I just don't care about, or just at a moment in time, I might be interested in just getting into the game as quickly as I can, and then maybe on a second playthrough or something, I'll come back and like change that character's appearance. I also am not super happy. This seems to be a design trend that seems to be happening. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe it's been there the whole time. I'm also not like super happy of this thing of like gatekeeping changing your character's appearance. Like to me, like what does it matter? Like it's the gamer's experience. If the gamer wants to change their character's appearance partway through their playthrough, just let them change their appearance. Like this whole thing of making it like a breadcrumb of a reward that you need to achieve to get access to change your character's appearance. Like I don't get that, nor do I have time to be bothered. But Veilguard's character generator to me cuts that line. It seems to give you a lot of options, so you can get in and change the character's appearance. But it also doesn't force you through those. You can skip many of them and bypass them, and it also has the huge thing that I favor, which is it has a lot of those options that can just be randomized. I will agree. Now, the character generator in Veilguard also has multiple stages and steps in it that cause you to make choices that are woven into your character's background and makeup, and that your backstory, and that impacts some dialogue branches, some scripting branches in characters' spoken lines, NPC spoken lines, AI spoken lines about your character when interacting with them. And those I totally agree that okay, like you can keep those locked, right? Nobody should, you don't want that, that context shift like in the middle of a game, particularly right if it actually has potential impact on the outcome of the game and story branches that you can get into and relationships that you have with characters. So I understand that. But back to the DEI thing, most people's problem seems to be with the pro-diversity choices and options that you're given in the character creator. These are by these people who are aligned with this caricature Grums, who's on Twitter, who's a completely non-credible. I personally refer to them as an NPE, a non-person entity, which is a term that we use in software for a bunch of code that is not actually a human being, because that person seems very much to be cut in that vein. And I made the comment the other day that the people who follow that individual believe the things that they say, that they don't have an aggregate intelligence level that would fill a thimble. So like it's just they're just intellectually bankrupt in the dialogue that they have. I accept and I acknowledge the concern that there are people who don't want diversity for diversity's sake. But again, much in the analogous vein of what I commented about the CWA, they seem to boogeyman everything, create problems that aren't really there, talk about negative impacts or negative trends that are completely irrelevant. And again, some of this is going to be based on personal choice. I've played through the opening sequence of Dragon Age: The Veilguard, which I really like. It's very kind of James Bond, 007-esque, in like that opening sequence that's always in a James Bond movie. The two female characters that are in there are not like archetypes of attraction. That didn't bother me one bit, because they're supposed to be adventurers and they're supposed to be warriors and they're supposed to be combatants. And I'm not worried about how much cleavage they're showing on the screen, or how sexy some of these. It's just not my personal interaction with animated content, modeled content, computer generated content. I get it, and I'm fine with people who are. All of us have preferences about video games. The part where it gets outside my personal threshold of like acceptable behavior is all the yelling and screaming and pitchforks and torch raising and behaving as if you're going to storm the Bastille, or behaving as if there's some like whatever. And I go back to my problem with the notion is that this behavior is oriented around presenting this aspect as if there's like not content, right, that those people can go consume. As I often make references to, if you're a PC gamer, there are tons of hentai games on Steam. There's an innumerable amount. There are 14,000 games released on Steam every single year. There are hundreds of games, maybe thousands of games that have that type of content. If that is your concern, I don't know what the game mechanics are on those games. I don't know if those games are ever going to compete for Game of the Year. I don't know if they have enough substance in them from a story perspective, from a game mechanic perspective. But, those are the things that I think maybe I would get bothered by in terms of a critical take about a game. But like if the thing that you need to be critical about is yelling and screaming about the physical attractiveness of characters, then again, that content is out there. It's not as if it's been taken off the market. It's not as if there are not video games being made that are primarily oriented around a white heterosexual protagonist. It's not as if those games are gone, and that's where I would have some credibility in the argument or in that perspective. I would consider it much more credible if the content had just been gone. Like, look, I've been around gaming for an incredibly long time. I've lived through specific pockets in history that I can cite and go back to of when like when real-time strategy games like fell out of prominence right in the gaming industry. Years where simulation games were not being made, flight simulators weren't being made, to the extent that peripheral manufacturers went out of business. Right, all the consolidation, the Mad Cats, the SciTech, right? Companies that have gone out of business or that have been acquired because there wasn't enough of a capital base to warrant them continuing to make those peripherals. But that's not the case with, I don't know, non-DEI content. We get a lot of the same, razzing about people who are upset about politics in video games. I feel like that's not necessarily an argument whose logic that I really follow, because that's part of the real world. And we constantly ask for the real world to be modeled in video games. So I don't know, whatever. My whole point is that a lot of these people made the assertion or the claim that Dragon Age was going to do poorly. Dragon Age might do poorly, but I think it has a ton more to do with BioWare, right? And the fact that studio has just kind of fallen off of its pedestal in being one of the marquee studios of the industry, just as, in my opinion, Bethesda has, Square Enix has. Blizzard made a lot of missteps. They seem to have brought it back with Diablo 4, and so they're kind of back on top. CD Projekt Red fell off lost the mission with the initial output of Cyberpunk. They seem to be working their way back. A lot of these studios that we felt were marquee studios and were on the come up in the early 2000s and have continued their legacies on into the 2010s, right? A lot of them fell off their high performance mantra in the 2010s with some bad releases. And I think BioWare, who, Mass Effect Andromeda, obviously Anthem, clearly like lost the mission and lost their focus and weren't sticking the landing with some of their releases. If Dragon Age doesn't do well, it's going to be because of that. It's going to be because of performance. It's going to be because of operational excellence. It's going to be because of technical and creative and artistic acumen. I don't think it's going to be because of the color of a character or whether a character's sexy, but that's just me. Let's move on to the final story. Okay, now this was going to be a section that I was going to start incorporating in the show, which was kind of gaming philosophy 101, a little more opinion based, less of me kind of pulling threads on historical context. I don't know if we're going to head in that direction. I think I want to, but I don't know if this story fits that description. But at any rate, AMD Ryzen 7 9800 X3D now official at $479, launching next week. Senior Vice President and General Manager for Computing and Graphics Jack Hoon has officially introduced the new 9800 X3D SKU. The 9800 X3D officially offers a 500 megahertz higher frequency than its predecessor, the 7800 X3D. This new 8-core Zen 5 processor is the first in this product line to feature built-in 3D V-cache, providing an extra 64 megabyte layer for improved gaming workloads. AMD confirms this is a second-generation X3D, where the CCD, or core complex die, with 8 Zen 5 cores, is placed over the cache, reversing the order compared to last-gen series. So really why I want to talk about this article wasn't really necessarily about the 9800 X3D, but was about kind of what's going on with Intel. And I'm a little pressed for time, so we're going to push here to get through. Now, if you've been paying attention to the PC industry and what's been going on with CPUs, October, in my opinion, was a bonga month. We are heading into a bonga quarter, and just really kind of a great time for DIY PC enthusiasts in general, and one that we, in my opinion, I think, if I recall correctly, we haven't really had over the last 3 years, particularly if you go kind of back to like the pandemic and pre-pandemic times, meaning that it's been a while since both AMD and Intel were putting out chips at the same time. Typically, those things have been off cadence. There's been a whole push-pull. One company puts out a new chip, the other company is able to counter not with a new product, but by reducing the price on its already on-chip SKUs, and then we'll come out with a thing later. So it hasn't been things that we saw during, in my opinion, and again, could be revisionist history, in the Pentium 3, Pentium 4 times where there was this aspect of Intel and AMD going head-to-head, product to product, and that makes it a fairly exciting time. Right now, my belief from what I see in the landscape around hardware reviewers are trying, like, there's been a lot of stuff that's gone on with getting benchmarks right. There's been problems with the Intel processors, obviously with the over minimum voltage in the 13,900, 14,900. There's been the whole Windows 24 H2 thing with the 9000 series Zen 5 AMD Ryzen processors. I think because they've been burnt in the recent past, hardware reviewers are really trying to make sure that they get this head-to-head comparison between the 9000 series processors and the new Intel Core Ultra 200S series processors, the Arrow Lake processors, right. And so most of what things that are coming out now, from what I've seen, are still kind of individual takes on the processors, not really yet synthesizing the head-to-head. I think we're going to see those going into November, particularly as these X3D parts come out. But the other thing that's going on is Intel has been severely under duress. Intel actually made less money Intel actually lost more money last quarter than it made in revenue. A lot of those things are happening because of write-downs. A lot of those things are happening because they're trying to write off expenses. They're burdening their earnings sheet with the cost of restructuring and organizational changes. So I get that. But the other things that have gone on is, I think we have pretty, I don't know if it's been corroborated, but I think we have pretty strong reason to believe that Qualcomm went after Intel, investigating a merger and an acquisition. I want to say that I think there was also a rumor that ARM was going after them, or had, made an offer. And most of those efforts to make acquisitions were about trying to acquire the core computing business and not necessarily the foundry side of their businesses. They've talked about spinning those businesses off and restructuring. So, a lot of things are going on that you go back 20 years ago, like we never would have had this conversation. We've gone through multiple decades where like the default, for particularly if you're buying a laptop, has always been Intel. Like you would never really consider, if you were an enthusiast and a person who was going after performance, you would never really go after or consider an AMD processor on laptop unless you were like, dedicatingly down the path of trying to maximize your cost savings. Maybe you were buying a second laptop or a laptop that you didn't really care that much about. But in the desktop space, it has gotten much more heated and much more competitive, in particular with this min voltage thing that really caught Intel in a higher degree of vulnerability than I would say they've really experienced over the last few years. For me personally, since I built on AMD, I don't know, like I said, 20 plus years ago, in the Athlon era, as Athlon 64 hit, and I want to say Athlon FX, if I get the processor names correct, there was some dropping off, I think, of the comparison between Intel and AMD, and I went away from AMD and built on Intel. But then with the return of Ryzen, me personally, I haven't seen any reason, price to performance wise, why a person would build on Intel. Me personally, and I get that there are some people who are like have this concept that they go with Intel for reliability or because of some like lack of trust of AMD. In the Ryzen 1000 era, that was okay. Maybe a little bit in the 2000s, but like as we've gone on to like 3000, 5000, 7000, I don't get it. Right? To me, if you're just a quantitative person and you're looking at the price to performance, with the exception of Alder Lake, and I have one of my PC builds here. I have 5 PC builds. I have one that is on an Alder Lake build. And that was a moment in time where I felt like Intel snatched that performance crown, and price to performance ratio was reasonable. They kind of snatched that crown back. But out of 5 PC builds here, like 4 of them are built on Ryzen. And we're starting to see, and again, we've historically had this thing about market share and how it's always been egregiously in the direction of Intel. But in the PC enthusiast in the performance space, these X3D processors, at least in that subsector, from what I can tell, I'm not an industry expert on sales in like particularly like very hyper focused segments of the industry, but it seems from what I can tell that these X3D processors have just been eating Intel's lunch on that subsector. As these 9000 X3D processors come out, it seems apparent that they are quote unquote better than Arrow Lake's enthusiast part, the 280, which I think their high end part right now is the 285K. And so it's going to be interesting to see what happens going into this fall and in this round. I wonder if we're kind of seeing an Xbox equivalent, right, in generations, where in terms of like this is just, is this kind of the last generation of the enthusiast processor space and segment that Intel can afford to lose? And what happens as a result of it. So I don't know. We'll see. It's a super interesting time, in my opinion. I said the same thing kind of at the start of this console generation, in that each of the 3 vendors was kind of, in my opinion, taking a strategic route that was highly differentiated. Nintendo had focused on the low end of the market, not worried about compute bells and whistles. PlayStation was focused on the high end of the console market and hardware market. Software market as well, titles, marquee AAA high end titles, and Xbox was focused on its services, and it has continued to become even more hyper-focused on its services if you go to the quotes from Amy Hood at their last earnings call. And so I wonder if again, also if we're also seeing, momentous time in the CPU market as well, in the consumer space. What's going on in the server side and in enterprise and cloud and AI is different. But it'll be interesting to see what happens here now. Particularly in a time where AMD has said that they're not really going after NVIDIA from in terms of like the high end GPU market. That is not the case with the CPU market. They are continuing to run straight at Intel. And so, again, like I said, it'll be interesting to see how this comes out. So thanks a lot for anybody who stopped through the live stream. I appreciate you. For anybody who watches the archive version of this episode of Talking About Games on the Rounding Off Infinity Gaming channel on YouTube, I appreciate you as well. Please feel free to like the video and subscribe to the channel so you can just receive a notification whenever I post new content. As I say on Enough to Keep Going, it's not about monetization. I don't monetize my YouTube channel. It is simply out of my desire to make things as convenient for you as possible. So like I said, you get that notification from YouTube whenever I go live, because I don't have like a regular schedule or anything like that. It's just, I post on the YouTube channel. I try to do it, a few days in advance of when I'm going to do Talking About Games, but you can keep an eye out here that way, or you can follow me on Twitter or Blue Sky in Lee Hampton or Hamp on both of those socials. So just look for me there. Until next time, take care of yourselves. Stay safe out there. Play the games that you like. Come here to talk to me about the games that you love. Once again, one last thing that I'll mention. I'll try and mention pretty quickly. I went over a lot of my initial takes on Dragon Age: The Veilguard earlier. I did want to mention, like specifically, I did pick that game up on the Epic Game Store. I started it last night. I'm locked in. Love what I experienced out of the first. The initial onboarding. Onboarding is huge for me. I think for anybody who's listened to me on any podcast, I put a lot of stock into it. It determines whether I stick with the game or fall off. I don't stick with games in an effort to wait until they get good. That's not my job or my responsibility. It's your responsibility to make a good game that grabs my interest at the outset. Doesn't put a lot of inefficiency, low quality of life, and just bull crap in my windshield. And right now that onboarding and initial experience in Dragon Age: The Veilguard has been good. So I'm looking at getting more into it this weekend. So until next time, take care of yourselves. Stay safe out there. Play the games that you like. I'm here to talk to me about the games that you love. Once again, my name has been Game Logic or Hamp on the Rounding Off Infinity Gaming channel on YouTube. One of the co-hosts of the Enough to Keep Going Weekly Games podcast, as well as the Basement Radio Arcade podcast. Frequent guest on the Damage Per Second podcast. Until next time, good night. Actually, it's good morning. So have a great day. Good luck and good gaming. That's going to do it for me. I'm out of here.